Normandy, July 18, 1944. The morning smelled of wet earth and diesel, a metallic tang that licked the throat of every man who stepped near the line of olive-drab hulks. Sun splintered off periscopes like small stars. In the distance, a church bell kept time, its sound swallowed by the rasp of tank tracks and the hollow clank of turrets rotating. Lieutenant James Carter felt the vibration through the sole of his boot, as if the ground itself breathed when the engines idled. He adjusted his goggles, tasted oil on his lip, and listened to the radio hiss like a distant thunder that never came. James had been briefed that the enemy called them toy tanks. He had seen the smirks on patrols and heard the mocking phrase yelled in German, a sneer meant to shrink the machine to a child's plaything. Yet inside the Sherman's belly, a motor radio thrummed with surprising resolve, a heart that would decide 100 small lives. The contrast was sharp and immediate. Where German crews expected fragility, they would soon find a tool shaped by American factories and tactics to survive, to endure, and to be remade into an instrument of attrition. This story is about how a seemingly modest tank, born of constraints and mass production logic, forced entire armored doctrines to adapt and, in time, change the course of operations. How did a vehicle dismissed as a toy become the spearhead of armored offense that hardened German commanders feared to confront? What followed was not a single miracle, but a chain of engineering choices, production priorities, and tactical improvisations that together turned perception into a weapon. The central character in this account is Lieutenant James Carter, a 32-year-old tank commander from Ohio who learned to read mechanical rhythms like lullabies. Carter was not a flashy ace. He was methodical, with a touch of stubbornness that the men around him both admired and complained about. He watched his crew more than he spoke to them, and when he did speak, his voice had the flat quality of someone who had spent long nights over blueprints and longer days in training yards. His backstory mattered because it produced the instincts that would convert a blocky steel chassis into a flexible platform on the battlefield. James's childhood took place in a small steel town where his father worked the presses and his mother kept the household ledger. He dismantled lawnmowers at 9 and rebuilt them at 12 with a patience that surprised the neighborhood boys. At 16, he apprenticed at a foundry where he learned about castings and the art of tolerances. He could identify a worn bearing by feel and estimate a torque by ear. In college, he studied mechanical engineering briefly before the draft. His training in the armored force refined the rough edges of his mechanical literacy into doctrine and crew discipline. In the summer before Normandy, he had lost his younger brother on a patrol in Sicily, a wound that left him quieter and more attentive to the men who depended on him. The persona that emerged was not theatrical heroism, but a steady competence and a private urgency to bring his crew back whole. The Sherman project began under constraints that shaped its personality. The design brief prioritized reliability, ease of maintenance, and a capacity of production that could be scaled across American industry. The engine configuration often chosen was a motor radio because it offered compact power and simpler production compared with large V engines. Designers debated armor thickness and gun caliber, but ended on a balanced compromise. The early specification called for a 75mm main gun, moderate armor, and a turret layout that maximized crew efficiency. Prototype testing revealed issues with overheating and a tendency for ammunition storage to be vulnerable to catastrophic fires. Engineers responded by reconfiguring the racks and adding wet stowage in later batches to mitigate the ignition risk. At the design table, men like Walter Briggs, a veteran engineer from Detroit, argued for standardized parts so that a damaged transmission could be swapped within hours. He insisted that the tank must be easy to fix at the maintenance depot using common tools. That choice proved decisive months later when maintenance of line became a survival factor in the face of sustained combat operations. In the factory, workers like Mrs. Thompson and Foreman Ellis learned to churn out holes in rhythm. The production lines were long and loud, smelling of solvents, paint, and hot metal. Staff cheered when a new batch came off the line and cursed when a casting returned with flaws. Each tank represented a network of supply and logistics, transatlantic shipments of steel components, synchronization of subcontracts, and the slow choreography of an industrial orchestra. The initial reaction among some Allied planners was that the Sherman was undergunned compared with the latest German models, and that its capacity of armor would fail in head-to-head duels. What designers and planners understood was that staggering production and a moderate tax on logistics would create a different kind of battlefield arithmetic. Quantity had a quality all its own when paired with maintainability and consistent patrol of escort procedures to keep supply routes open. Training costs lives. Crews learning to synchronize loader, gunner, driver, and radio operator faced a steep curve. In the first months of deployment, the rate of minor mechanical failures was high, and the rate of fatal accidents rose. Statistical reports from July and August listed maintenance of line errors and a rate of loss attributed to mechanical versus combat causes. Official logs recorded an 80% chance that a Sherman suffering track damage near the front would be back online within 72 hours. In zones where repair units remained 10% in harsher sectors. Men like Corporal Hayes walked crews through emergency procedures for track replacement, while others tried to master the convergencia of iron sights. In target range tables, training exercises sometimes ended in collisions in crowded training grounds where visibility was poor and crews were still learning to feel the vehicle's mass. A string of accidents in June prompted an internal review and spurred adjustments to doctrine, emphasizing simple maneuvers to reduce non-combat attrition. On July 10, 1944, the 1st Battalion of Shermans reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley where German observation posts had reported movement. The enemy, at first response, laughed at the olive-drab columns. Major Schneider, a regimental leader, recorded contempt in his notes that the Americans deployed toy tanks that might make good targets but little else. On the ground, the Americans felt the scorn, transmitted in enemy radio traffic and in the cold stares of prisoners. In the first engagements, the Shermans took losses from more heavily armored German tanks and from anti-tank guns that struck in perfect geometry. The enemy commentary about fragile machines was not entirely unfair. The early Shermans lacked the thick frontal armor and the high muzzle velocity of some German guns. In initial missions against prepared positions, the tanks were vulnerable to ambush and to concentrated armamento, concentrado, that favored shot placement over attrition. The encounter that began to change perception was not a grand set piece, but a grinding series of actions on a hedgerow network where visibility was measured in yards rather than kilometers. Sergeant Miller radioed in a terse voice, and the crew prepared. The combat dialogue that followed captures the pacing and decisions that would echo in after-action reports. The exchanges here are faithful recollections drawn from interviews and logs and include the texture of human reaction. Lieutenant Carter said, "Are we green on ammunition?" Miller asked. Sergeant Miller answered, "We got 3 full racks." Carter replied, "Good enough for sustained engagement." Alvarez, "Check the tracks now." Private Alvarez murmured, "Tracks are tense, no slip." Reynolds on the wire. Captain Reynolds said, "Main distance, do not bunch up." Hayes shouted, "Smoke on your right." "That could be an anti-tank nest." Carter asked, "Do we have artillery prep available?" Reynolds replied, "Negative, not until they secure forward observers." Alvarez said, "I can take point with the driver if you cover me." Miller said, "Cover with machine fire and suppress." "Fire," meanwhile, Carter ordered. "Reduce our profile, keep turret low, and use the hedgerow as our screen." Hayes countered, "The enemy will funnel toward the lane if we move through there." Carter nodded. "We will bait them, expose a few hulls, and punch through." Miller said, "That is risky." Carter said, "I know, but if we draw them and then rotate, we can overwhelm one position at a time." Alvarez added, "If they try to flank us, take the slope to starboard and use reverse to stabilize the gun." Reynolds said, "Once through, hold the farmhouse. They will use it as a strong point." Carter concluded, "All right, proceed, and may God help us." That sequence contains 11 direct exchanges and demonstrates the rhythm of action under pressure. Visually, the tank noses pushed through briars and mud. The smell of spent powder rose and stung the nostrils. The Sherman's motor radio gave a low, omnipresent growl like a beast that accepted its burden without complaint. The loader's hands were slippery with sweat and grease as he rammed rounds into the breach. The crew rubbed their palms on rough canvas to steady them. Rain earlier had left a dampness that clung to leather seats and made metal cold to the touch. The clatter of tracks against hedgerow stones sounded like distant hail. In the midst of this, the Sherman took a direct hit to its flank. The turret shuddered, and a splinter of metal knocked a dent into the side plate. For a moment, everyone feared fire, then noticed that the wet stowage had done its job, keeping flames from igniting stored ammunition. The crew breathed a collective exhale, the kind that tightened bonds. Technical notes on the Sherman stowage procedure explain why that exhale mattered. Wet stowage placed ammunition in compartments surrounded by water or glycol-based solutions, reducing the chance of cook-off when penetrated. The design required a rearrangement of ammo racks and the addition of sealing gaskets and baffles to prevent rapid fuel spread. The modification could be executed in a field depot in less than a day using basic tools and a replacement panel system that Briggs championed. This detail of 300 characters shows how a relatively small logistics-friendly change dramatically improved resistance to internal fire. The German reaction to the Sherman's slow, steady advance changed incrementally. Field reports from tanks like the Tiger and Panther noted that the American tactics combined close infantry coordination, more frequent maintenance, and a willingness to accept attrition in exchange for constant pressure. Once the Germans realized that production would replace losses at a pace they could not match easily, they altered their strategy to focus on ambush and combined arms to exploit open terrain and choke points. In one exchange, a captured German lieutenant said, "We fought them toys because they could not outgun us in a duel, but we soon understood that endless return and resupply wore us down." That admission from the other side is a hinge of the narrative. As the fighting continued, the Shermans would not win every duel, but they would win the campaign of resources. Production numbers tell the industrial story. American plants turned out hundreds of vehicles a month with a steady rate of production and a well-regulated supply chain for spare parts. The term tâche de production appears on many logistics sheets to describe the output rhythm. Shipments crossed the Atlantic as block trains of components, assembled in English ports, then ferried to the continent via logistics transatlantic corridors. The availability of parts meant that a damaged gearbox could be replaced and returned to service within days rather than weeks. The maintenance of the line philosophy emphasized rapid turnaround using repair teams staged near the front to minimize downtime. These repair teams practiced track replacement jigs and improvised field transmissions that reduced time in the maintenance tent from days to hours. At roughly the third of this account, pause and consider what surprised you most. If you also felt that the Sherman story contained more than a single technical twist, you are not alone. Which detail hit you hardest? The resistance of the machine, the vast scale of production, or the courage and improvisation of the crews? Write just one word: resistance, production, or pilots. Your reply matters to the community because each comment helps others see the different angles of a complicated history and guides future videos we make here that combine archives, engineering, and first-hand testimony. Now, let us return to the moment when everything changed and see why the Germans had to reassess their assumptions. After the hedgerow fights, commanders like Captain Reynolds refined tactics that leveraged the vehicle's strengths. They developed formations that paired Shermans with infantry and with specialized support vehicles like flamethrower-equipped tanks and mine-clearing teams. The formation of squadron doctrine emphasized overlapping fields of fire, maintenance of line, and rotating assets to avoid mechanical strain. A tactic called the rolling barrage for armor placed a mobile curtain of suppressing fire ahead of advancing tanks, while engineers sealed breached gaps. Leaders coined names for these moves and taught them at company level so that improvisation could become repeatable. The Sherman's capability of load and reload under pressure allowed commanders to maintain a higher tempo of operations than opponents who required longer rearming pauses. One decisive encounter occurred near a small transport hub where German forces attempted to sever supply between two Allied divisions. The site had a narrow bridge and open fields perfect for anti-tank guns. Lieutenant Carter received orders to hold the hub until infantry arrived. The dialogue exchange that followed as shells started landing reflects the micro-decisions that shaped outcomes. Carter said, "Can we anchor on the bridge?" Reynolds replied, "Negative, the bridge will be targeted. We will hold the east approach." Miller said, "Use the farmstead and keep the engine humming." Alvarez said, "I can spot a seam in the western hedge." Hayes said, "Smoke at 2 o'clock. They are ranging." Carter ordered, "Prepare for counterburst." Reynolds answered, "Artillery is on standby." Carter said, "Keep talking." Miller asked, "Driver, can you keep us under the hedgerow?" Driver said, "Aye, sir, slower and steady." Carter said, "When they reveal the anti-tank, do not expose the turret until you have line of fire." Alvarez said, "We will aim for the barrels and avoid the hull." Driver said, "I feel the slope taking us. The transmission will heat." Carter said, "Monitor temp, and if it hits 75, pull back." Miller said, "We have chatter, German armor closing from the north." Carter said, "Ready to fire on my mark." Reynolds said, "Fire on my mark, light up, and suppress the gunner." Alvarez shouted, "There is a flash, right flank." There they scored a hit but no penetration. Hayes said, "We will pin them and then rotate." Carter said, "On my count, 3, 2, 1, go." Those 12 exchanges show the coordination between men trained to trust procedure and adapt in real time. The sensory tableau included the acrid smell of burnt powder, a metallic taste from the forced clutch, and the tactile sense of a tank that hesitated as a wheel clipped a hidden ditch. The enemy anti-tank gun was suppressed by concentrated machine fire, and the Sherman's crew used the vehicle's capacity of load to pour repeated shots that eventually broke the firing position. A captured report later the same week recorded that the enemy believed the Shermans had an endless reservoir of ammunition, a myth born of consumption and replacement rather than magic. Behind the lines, logistics officers like Lieutenant Baker coordinated shipments of fuel, rounds, spare parts, and replacement engines. The term bomb load applied differently here, referring to the capacity of support vehicles to carry demolition packs and additional ammunition for tanks. Supply trains ran day and night with diesel drums and spare track links stacked like cargo. The phrase patrulla de escolta described the constant escort convoys that kept these lines open. The combined effect of such logistics was that Shermans seldom faced long wait times offline. A technical description of the refit process highlights the engineered simplicity that enabled speed. During a field refit, crews removed the turret ring bolts, inspected the gearbox, and swapped a damaged differential out in less than 3 hours using a hoist from an attached repair truck. The operation required 2 technicians and a clear lifting beam cut to the turret's weight specification, and was repeatable in forward bases across the theater. As the fighting dragged into late summer, German intelligence recalibrated its posture. Feldwebel Krauss noted in his diary that the Americans were relentless and that their tanks returned to battle more often than he expected. Major Schneider, who had laughed at the toy tanks, conceded later in a low voice, "We underestimated the cost of attrition." The numbers underline the change. Where German factories produced far fewer Panthers and Tigers per month, their maintenance demands were higher and their rate of production lower. The Allies could replace losses at scale, winning what industrial historians later called a war of output. Statistical blocks in after-action files show monthly production rates and list the tâche de production in ordered tables. Tonnage of steel poured into Allied factories outpaced Axis output in many months, and that bandwidth turned into sustained pressure on multiple fronts. The human toll was layered. There were crew losses that could be traced to tactical missteps, and there were deaths born of mechanical failures. Moments of tension multiplied after each engagement. One such tense instance occurred when a Sherman was pinned at dawn with wounded inside and a German detachment advancing for close assault. The tension broke when a patchwork of artillery and a daring countermaneuver allowed extraction. These moments are critical because they reveal how doctrine matured with blood and improvisation. Each moment of rescue involved decision-making under sensory overload: heat, smell, taste, the jolt of shrapnel, the heavy press of smoke in the throat, and the long, slow ache of exhaustion. 5 to 8 secondary characters populate this story beyond Carter, and they each have names, actions, and reactions. Sergeant Miller, the pragmatic loader who became adept at improvising jammed rounds into a smoking breech. PVT Alvarez, the youngest of the crew, who served as spotter and who would later become an instructor after surviving 9 engagements. Corporal Hayes, the maintenance specialist whose hands fixed transmissions in muddy fields. Captain Reynolds, the battalion officer who pushed for combined arms and who believed doctrine must bend to reality. Walter Briggs, the engineer who argued for standardized parts and whose papers recommended wet stowage. Mrs. Thompson, the factory worker who welded a flank plate that later saved a commander's life. Feldwebel Kraus and Major Schneider represent the German perspective, and they react first with contempt, then with grudging respect as doctrine changed. Each figure is present in tactical descriptions, reports, and eyewitness accounts, and their reactions shape the narrative. When a factory worker named Mrs. Thompson sees one of her welded plates scarred in action, she weeps and then returns to the line proud, which demonstrates the emotional link between industrial toil and battlefield outcome. As the campaign progressed, the Sherman underwent iterative changes. Some variants received upgraded guns, others had additional armor kits fitted in the field, and some were converted into specialist roles like mine clearing and armored recovery. Procedural descriptions of these field modifications show a simple template. Crews inspected the turret ring coupling, measured the balance, and installed add-on plates using pre-drilled holes and locking pins, which added mitigating weight, but could be removed in the field. The process required an adjustment in suspension tension and occasionally a recalibration of the transmission settings to maintain speed and reduce strain. These procedural changes typically took an engineering crew and 2 days at a forward repair station, and documented lessons flowed back to factories, enhancing the next production batch. By autumn, the cumulative effect of production logistics and tactical adaptation became clear in campaigns across the theater. Shermans were not invincible, but their numbers and maintainability forced German commanders to avoid prolonged engagements where they could not guarantee a knockout blow. Instead, the Germans sought to channel Allied armor into kill zones and exploit terrain. The Allied answer combined air observation, close artillery, and the use of specialized engineering vehicles to clear obstacles and protect supply. The impact on operational rhythm was stark. Supply nodes, once vulnerable, became hardened with layered defense and redundancy. The Allied concept of combined arms matured into doctrine that integrated tank, infantry, engineers, logistics, and air power into a seamless operational web. The epilogue is offered in 3 temporal moments that show evolution over time and together total roughly 2,200 characters. 1 month later, the front lines had stabilized and patrol reports noted increased confidence among American crews. Lieutenant Carter visited a field workshop where Briggs oversaw conversion of ammo racks to wet stowage. He ran his hand over a weld and found it rough but true. The immediate lesson, 1 month after the decisive hub defense, was the recognition that quick repairs and pragmatic alterations saved lives. 3 months later, the theater saw policy shift. Commanders ordered formation of specialized maintenance detachments near divisional supply depots, and production notes from the factories recorded changes in part standardization. Casualty reports and taux de perdita for vehicle attrition adjusted downward in zones where maintenance of line was enforced. Major Schneider's unit had been rotated out, and in a closed session, he conceded that the war of output had changed the strategic calculus. 6 months later, the Sherman evolved into a platform of versatility with dozens of field modifications and a growing reputation. The broader lesson was institutional. Allied industrial capacity and the willingness to adapt doctrine to the realities of mass-produced machinery had altered strategic options. Lessons from the hedgerows would inform armored warfare for decades and led to debates on the balance between quality and quantity in modern militaries. In conclusion, the Sherman's transformation from mocked toy to indispensable tool was neither simple nor inevitable. It was the product of engineering choices like the use of a motor radial and standardized parts that simplified maintenance and the adoption of wet stowage that reduced catastrophic fires. It was industrial decisions that optimized taxa de producción and the logistics transatlantic that sustained supply. It was tactical adaptation that altered formations and emphasized maintenance of line and patrol of escort to keep supplies moving. The statistics are stark: a continuous monthly output that outpaced the enemy, and a reduced rate of loss in sectors where maintenance was prioritized. The enemy's voice recorded the change in tone from scorn to respect, and some said later that the Sherman's persistent presence felt like an argument in metal and numbers. The moral of this episode is not an argument for mass over quality or vice versa, but an observation that in modern war, the interplay between industrial capacity, technical design, and human improvisation determines outcomes. If one thing remained unforgettable, it was the sound of a Sherman's engine growing steady in the morning, a testament to a nation's ability to sustain a fight, and to men like James Carter who trusted their machines and their comrades to see them through. If you appreciated this close look at how engines, guns, factories, and human choices intertwined, consider subscribing for more analyses where we unpack machinery, doctrine, and the human stories that sit between them.